climate change is a hot topic in the news. We have increasingly been emitting greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide since the Industrial Revolution. In 2019, we released 36 billion tons of CO2 equivalents, and this number is only going up. But this number needs to go down to zero as soon as possible. In rich countries, overconsumption is the norm. More energy in production is demanded. The earth is being used more intensely, and more people are driving their cars and using planes. Even more, the global population is still growing and will not stop growing anytime soon. With more countries industrializing, the greenhouse gas emissions are only likely to increase the coming decades. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC in short, human emissions are responsible for almost 100% of the global warming. But the question of responsibility is up for debate. Developed countries, which emitted the most historically, are pointing their fingers towards growing giants like China, which are emitting the most currently. But undeveloped or poor countries have the most to lose, since adapting to climate change is either not possible or too expensive. Now, the world has agreed we need to do something in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, but we haven't agreed on who has to do the most. Rich and developed countries have the resources to adapt and point at their own efforts, but developing countries point at rich countries, saying that they got rich by emitting and should therefore do more. So, which countries can be held responsible for climate change, and who needs to do the most to resolve this? In this explainer, we will focus specifically on nation states. The warmest 20 years have been recorded in the last 22 years, and since the 1850s, the average temperature has risen by about 1.1 degrees Celsius. And a temperature rise of 1 degree Celsius might seem small and insignificant, but it can have significant impact on our climate and our natural systems. Furthermore, this average rise in temperature masks larger variations of warming across the world. Global average temperatures over land have increased almost twice as much as over the ocean. And since the northern hemisphere contains more land mass, the average change in temperature has been greater north of the equator than south. The highest increase in temperature can be found near the poles, which are, unfortunately, the regions which could experience the largest impact, like sea ice, permafrost and glacial melt. In recent years, the consequences of rising greenhouse gases and increasing temperatures have become more serious and visible. Almost every year, new records are set by extreme weather events. From extreme droughts and wildfires to floods and storms, climate change is pushing us to extremes. And maybe the most discussed consequence of global warming is the sea level rise, which can have disastrous effects on low-lying areas and coastal zones. Today, we collectively emit 36 billion tons of CO2 each year. The main contributors to this are China with 10 billion tons, the US with 5 billion tons, India with 3 billion tons, the EU with 3 billion tons, Russia 2 billion tons, and Japan with 1 billion tons. These countries collectively amount for 51% of the global population, 80% of global fossil fuel consumption, and emitted 67.5% of yearly global CO2 in 2019. So, a relatively small amount of countries are responsible for a relatively large amount of emissions, and we cannot solve this crisis without them. Now, when we look at emissions per capita, the picture shifts. In 2017, the global average was 4.8 tons of CO2 per person. Now, small oil states like Qatar and Kuwait dominate the top rankings. However, their absolute contribution is relatively low due to their low population size. For the bigger countries, high emissions per capita include Australia with 17 tons, the US with 16.2 tons, and Canada with 15.6 tons. Now, population-wise, big countries such as China and India emit 8 tons and 2.5 tons respectively. And these figures are in stark contrast with the poorer countries. In sub-Saharan countries such as Mali or Niger, the average footprint is around 0.1 ton per year, a number 160 times lower than the US. In just 2.3 days, the average American emits more than the average Nigerian in 1 year. The contrast between rich and poor countries is a trend that is ubiquitous. When looking at emissions relative to population, richer countries emit above average population-wise, while low-income countries have a lower share of global emissions relative to their populations. Of the biggest polluters, the US emits more than 3 times its population share, and China also emits considerably more than its share. Conversely, India, which is also one of the biggest emitters, is found far under its share. It gets even more difficult when we look at historical trends. Recent growth in emissions has been largely facilitated by growing countries such as China and India. But up until the 20th century, global emissions were dominated by the Western world. The US alone has emitted more than a quarter of all anthropogenic CO2 emissions, a figure twice as big as that of China, the second largest contributor at 12.6%. And the EU, where I'm from, 22%. Now, the poorer African countries have contributed less than 0.01% of total emissions. And even countries that now contribute far less to the total emission than in the past aren't there yet. And while emission can reduce, the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere will not immediately go down. With the 2015 Paris Agreement, 200 countries agreed that the global average temperature rise should be well below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. But to keep it even below 1.5 degrees, global CO2 emissions will have to be reduced to zero by around 2050. And this can only be done by getting rid of our addiction to fossil fuels. To achieve this, we'll have to rely on renewable energy from sun, wind, water, tides, and geothermal heat. But the question who must do what still haunts international politics, and it's not as straightforward as it might seem. Governments have the power to put up restrictions, and they should, because with great power comes great responsibility. Solutions such as carbon taxes have been proposed where the polluter must pay for their CO2 emissions, but due to many reasons, these haven't been effective so far. The rich countries are in a comfortable position. They got rich by freely polluting and have large historical emissions. And their wealth also means they have large emissions per capita. However, developing countries, especially China and India, are on the rise. China is currently the largest polluter in the world, but China also has the largest population. Now, in the Netherlands, where I'm from, we often wonder why we should even contribute to fighting climate change if we're such a small country. Well, the richest countries have the most resources, are highly educated, and can develop technology for low carbon solutions. This is important because we do not want developing countries increasing their fossil fuel usage, so cheap, sustainable methods should be developed. Still, this doesn't mean that developing countries bear no responsibility. China is still the largest emitter and India is still on the rise. They shouldn't copy the irresponsible behavior of rich countries. Instead, they should continue to develop in a sustainable manner. The claim that we're all responsible can be disempowering, but it still holds true. What we need to do is do our best, and right now, we're definitely not doing that. And pointing fingers gets us nowhere. Instead, we should join forces and tackle this huge climate challenge together. And we should begin today.